Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to see so many students and faculty and staff and members of the larger Duke and Durham community here today for our annual Lange Lecture. The Lange Lecture was established to honor Professor David Lange, who's right here, who retired. Professor Lange retired from Duke Law School in 2015 as the Melvin G. Shim Emeritus Professor of Law after 44 years on our faculty. A beloved teacher and renowned scholar, Professor Lange specializes in intellectual property, copyright, trademarks, unfair competition, and entertainment law. Professor Lange is particularly well known for his transformative work on the public domain, including his 1981 article, Recognizing the Public Domain, and his 2003 article, Reimagining the Public Domain, both of which were published in Duke's own journal, Law and Contemporary Problems. He is also the co-author of No Law, Intellectual Property in the Image of an Absolute First Amendment, written alongside fellow Duke Law professor, Jeff Powell, who is also alongside him today. Prior to Professor Lange's retirement, this endowed lecture was known as the Kip and Meredith Fry Lecture. In recognition of his career and contributions, they renamed it in Professor Lange's honor following his retirement. Professor Lange is here today with his family, and just delighted that you were all able to come. It is now my great honor and pleasure to recognize this year's Lange Lecturer, Christopher Sprigman. Professor Sprigman is the Murray and Kathleen Bring Professor of Law at NYU Law, where he teaches intellectual property law, antitrust law, torts, and comparative constitutional law, and is the co-director of the law school's Engelberg Center on Innovation Law and Policy. Before becoming a professor, Professor Sprigman did lots of things. I'm just going to name a few of them that I thought some of you might find interesting. He clerked for Judge Stephen Reinhart of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and Justice Lawrence H.W. Ackerman of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. He was appellate counsel from 1999 to 2001 in the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, where U.S. versus Microsoft was among his cases. And he was a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of King & Spalding. Most interesting to me, he joined the University of Virginia law faculty with me in 2005. We were baby law professors together. He joins us today to deliver his lecture, The Invention of Authenticity. Please join me in welcoming Professor Christopher Sprigman.
Carrie, thank you. And thanks to Chris Buckafusco as well for inviting me in for a wonderful dinner last night, and to David Lange and his family who are in the audience for being here, and for listening to me today talk about a subject that I think is, I hope anyway, is big enough for this lecture, which is authenticity. Specifically, what I want to explore across a range of settings is what we're saying when we label something authentic or the opposite, inauthentic or fake. So for example, what are we saying when we identify a painting as an authentic Vermeer or Twombly or Warhol? Let's focus on the last of those, Andy Warhol, for a moment. Warhol produced much of his art, as you likely know, at a workshop in New York City that he named The Factory. That label was part of Warhol's larger effort to blur the distinction between art and industrial manufacture. For most of his career, Warhol used studio assistants to help him make his work. And in some cases, Warhol's assistants made the work more or less from start to finish. So, does a silkscreen like this one, produced in the factory, but which Warhol may never have touched, count as an authentic Warhol? Some art historians, when they talk about Andy Warhol's work, proceed as if an artwork authorized by Andy Warhol, but not necessarily crafted by him, can qualify as an authentic Warhol. And Warhol himself often deliberately implied that his role in his own work was minimal. Consider this snippet from an interview that Warhol gave in 1966 to the men's magazine Cavalier. The interviewer asked about Warhol's famous series of Marilyn Monroe silkscreens. So Cavalier, the reporter says, are they all different? And Warhol responds, Most of them are. I use photographs. I made multiple color silk screen paintings, like my comic strip technique. Why don't you ask my assistant Jerry Malanga some questions? He did a lot of my paintings. Cavalier, Mr. Warhol, what's your role in making the paintings? Andy Warhol, I just select the subjects, things I don't have to change much. Cavalier, with such a lack of investment in your own work, what value, if any, could your paintings have for you? Andy Warhol, I really don't know. Let's set art aside for the moment and talk about something at least as important, which is money. What I want to ask about here is not how we know that a particular dollar or euro or pound is genuine or counterfeit, although that's an important authenticity question. What I'm interested in is more abstract. What precisely is it about money that makes it valuable? So what you see here is the gold vault of the US Federal Reserve Bank in New York City. It's buried 80 feet deep below the streets of Lower Manhattan, and it's the largest known gold storage site in the world. It's said to hold more than 500,000 gold bars, weighing 6.3 metric tons and worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But as much gold as there is in this vault, there are people who think the US should be holding a lot more of it. Specifically, the so-called gold bugs. These people argue that the US dollar is, in a very real sense, inauthentic as money. They belittle the US dollar as so-called fiat currency, that is, money that doesn't have an intrinsic value, but rather is propped up by a collective illusion that we have that it's valuable. And they argue for a return to the gold standard or some other currency system based on the value of a real asset. Paper money is only real, the gold bugs tell us, when every dollar can be redeemed for some little smidgen of gold. And it's not just the gold bugs who question the authenticity of paper money. It's also the Bitcoin crowd. They too deride the dollar as an act of mass collective self-deception. How can fiat money have value, they ask, when government can always make more of it? Better to return to hard money. But this time, money's hardness won't be tied to a scarce metal like gold, but to an algorithm that enforces scarcity. Okay, so everything I'll be talking about today comes from a book that I'm working on with my friend and co-author Cal Rostiala, who's here today. The book, tentatively titled The Invention of Authenticity, examines how we construct our understanding of authenticity in art, in money, in food, in wine, in fashion, and in many other shared parts of our culture. Technology is reshaping right now our understanding of what's real. What's authentic human creativity in an age of AI? What's an authentic live performance when ABBA holograms can perform a show without any human intervention that looks as real as the real thing? Part of the discussion I'm going to have today with you will be about laws that regulate authenticity. Part of the discussion will be about social norms, that is, informal rules that tell us what's authentic and what isn't. As we'll see, informal law enforced by social norms can be just as powerful as formal law enforced by police and lawyers and judges. And to see that in action, let's start with these lovely objects. So until very recently, the authenticity of a diamond was a simple matter of chemistry. A diamond is a stone composed of carbon atoms arranged in a crystal structure. There are materials, like cubic zirconia, that look very much like a diamond, but no one thinks that a stone made of cubic zirconia is a diamond. It's inauthentic. It's a fake. The question of what an authentic diamond is only became interesting starting in the 2010s. That's when the business of so-called lab-grown diamonds, gems with the same chemical, physical, and optical qualities as diamonds, but made in a lab rather than dug out of the earth, took off. Lab-grown diamonds have actually been around for a while. General Electric created the first ones in 1954, and by the early 70s, GE was making gemstone quality stones in the lab. But these early efforts didn't affect the market for diamonds very much because lab-made stones were extremely expensive to make. That changed in the early 2000s with the wide introduction of the chemical vapor deposition method. In 2008, the cost to produce a lab-grown diamond was approximately $4,000 per carat. It's now fallen to about $200 a carat. Today, lab-grown diamonds are about 30% cheaper than mined diamonds of like size and quality, and their costs will continue to fall as their price differential compared with mined diamonds continues to grow. And as the price of lab-grown diamonds falls, their market penetration has surged. In 2020, lab-grown diamonds accounted for about 7.5% of total new diamond supply. By 2023, that share had risen to 14.3%. By 2024, 18%, and this year, over 20% of the market. The result has been stagnation and even decline in the production of mined diamonds, and a significant drop in diamond prices. Over the past 2 years, the prices of mined diamonds have fallen by more than 25% to multi-year lows, and the price of lab-grown diamonds is falling even faster. According to a man named Jack Ogden, who's the president of something improbably named the British Society of Jewelry Historians, the collapse of diamond prices and the growth of the trade in lab-grown stones has people asking whether confidence in the future value of diamonds is about to disappear. It's a very artificial market, Ogden says. They're very valuable because people want to pay money for them. And people want to pay money for them because they're very valuable. If prices continue to fall, the feedback loop, he says, could collapse. So at this point, it's worth pausing to consider where this perception that diamonds are valuable comes from. As with gold and other precious metals, the value of diamonds is based on their supposed rarity. But in fact, most sorts of diamonds aren't particularly rare. Or to be precise, they aren't rare now. Before the 1870s, diamonds were rare. They were found mostly in India and Brazil, where they were discovered in the early 1700s. Global production of gem-quality diamonds was no more than a few pounds per year. Now that all changed in 1866 when this man, Erasmus Jacobs, discovered a small diamond on a bank of the Orange River in South Africa. By 1869, large diamond deposits were discovered near what would later become the South African town of Kimberley. These discoveries led to the foundation of the Kimberley mine, what you see here, the Big Hole, which yielded over 14.5 million carats of diamonds before mining ceased in 1914. So what followed upon the South African discovery was the world's first diamond rush, as fortune seekers flocked to the arid flatlands around Kimberley. But for the English investors who owned the new South African mines, the sudden flood of diamonds had a rather obvious downside. Unlike gold, which has immense value, linked to its use as a reserve asset, the most significant value diamonds has is as baubles. And without rarity, diamonds are little more than glorified glass. So the diamond magnates had a problem. But by 1888, this man, Cecil Rhodes, had put together the solution. For all intents and purposes, the company Rhodes founded, De Beers Consolidated Mines Limited, created the modern diamond industry. The command center of a global cartel with a stranglehold on just about every element of the industry. De Beers owned mines in South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, and Canada, and was a monopsony purchaser of diamonds from mines it didn't own. It controlled diamond cutting and polishing. And crucially, it built enormous stockpiles of diamonds, releasing them at a rate calculated to keep prices high and rising. The entire purpose of the De Beers cartel was to foster and maintain the illusion that diamonds were rare. Rarity was the foundation of diamonds' value and the principal characteristic that separated diamonds from less exalted gemstones. And that brings us back to today and to the emergence of lab-grown diamonds. For years, De Beers had profited by making diamonds seem rare. Now that strategy is under threat. But remember, monopolists like De Beers have resources, and when they're threatened, they can afford to go big. Ana de Armas big. So take a look at this recent ad, and note the name change. Diamond is now natural diamond. That shift communicates that the essential quality that sets a natural diamond apart from its lab-grown competitors is the diamond's origin in the earth. Not long ago, that was simply taken for granted, but now it's moved front and center. And there are other changes that De Beers is trying out. If you've ever purchased a diamond, you probably were told about the so-called 4 C's: color, cut, clarity, and carat weight. Recently, the traditional diamond industry has begun to emphasize something entirely at odds with that framing, but which, at least so far, lab-grown diamonds can't provide, and that's flaws. You're looking at a so-called salt and pepper diamond. Diamonds like this used to have a word attached to them, junk, unsellable junk. But just look at the price now, over $13,000 for a 2.5 carat diamond. Because now, according to a prominent diamond marketing website, it's the flaws or inclusions that make these diamonds special. Okay, so far we've been talking about how diamonds are sold. But since we're at a law school, let's spend a moment thinking about how they're regulated. In the United States, it's the Federal Trade Commission that regulates diamond marketing. Before 2018, the FTC required manufacturers to stick to 4 terms when describing lab-grown diamonds: lab-grown, lab-created, manufacturer-created, or synthetic. But in 2018, the FTC revised their guidelines. Now, marketers can use any of these terms or some other word or phrase of like meaning. The FTC also changed the definition of diamond to omit the word natural, which means the agency is now officially on record that a lab-grown diamond is a diamond. In line with that stance, the FTC will still allow mine diamond marketers to use the term synthetic to describe lab-grown diamonds, but the agency bans uses of that term that might suggest to consumers that man-made diamonds are not real. So although the FTC hasn't quite gotten to the point where a diamond is a diamond is a diamond, it appears to be moving in a direction which gives the lab-grown industry something like an equal footing. Now that said, if you take a look at the FTC's enforcement actions, like this letter to marketers, the picture isn't quite so clear. In some ways, the FTC supports the traditional diamond industry's view that the natural origin of a diamond is important. That's why the FTC warns lab-grown diamond marketers not to use the term above-ground real diamonds. The agency thinks this term might be understood by consumers to mean that the diamond comes from the earth, but it's just found on the surface, as diamonds sometimes are. Or in this enforcement letter, the FTC is warning a marketer not to use the term cultured diamond alongside the term lab-grown diamond, because using these 2 terms together, the agency thinks, might suggest to consumers that cultured diamonds are mined rather than manufactured. Now, I confess I'm skeptical that consumers would see it that way, but the FTC's enforcement actions at least make clear that the producers of lab-grown diamonds are struggling to find a term more romantic than lab-grown for their product. The term cultured diamond has a nicer ring to it, probably in part because it's already in use. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with cultured pearls. But the FTC is wary. The agency has said that it can be used only if it's accompanied prominently by either the lab-grown or manufacturer-created terms. So now that I've mentioned cultured pearls, I want to talk for a moment about their history. A century before the rise of lab-grown diamonds, the pearl industry too saw the rise of a manufactured competitor. Perhaps that episode will give us some insight into how the current situation in the diamond industry is likely to turn out. So unlike diamonds, natural pearls are in fact rare. Only about 1 in 10,000 wild oysters contains a pearl, and the number containing a gem quality pearl is a small fraction of that. Real rarity has always made natural pearls very expensive. So I'm from New York, and just an example, in 1917, the Cartier building on 5th Avenue was traded for a strand of natural pearls. But then in 1893, this man, Koichi Mikimoto, invented a new technique for artificially inducing oysters to develop pearls. Mikimoto placed into a mature oyster a fragment of a shell from a particular breed of freshwater clam. Interesting, the clam came from the Mississippi River. So this man in Japan searched all the world's clams until he found one that was genetically compatible with the oysters around him in Japan. And then he put a small bit of mantle tissue from another oyster into the oyster. The shell fragment acts as an irritant, and the transplanted mantle tissue secretes nacre, a form of calcium carbonate that pearls are made of. The result is a pearl, one produced in controlled conditions that can achieve near perfect roundness, absence of blemishes, and a nice degree of control over color. By 1919, Mikimoto was selling his manufactured pearls in Europe. The reaction was unsurprising. In 1921, an article in the London Star asserted that cultured pearls were sold by a certain Japanese merchant who is selling imitations that should not be labeled as pearls. a trade association of jewelry merchants, the Chambre syndicale, tried to restrict the importation of Mikimoto's pearls into France, warning buyers that Japanese pearls are fake pearls. The French government, for a time at least, agreed. And Lucien Pole, Mikimoto's French agent, was prohibited from importing 40 pearls from England into France. In response, Pole filed a defamation suit against the Chambre syndicale and its president, Hugh Citroën. In what became known in the pearl industry as the Paris trial, Pole argued that the Chambre syndicale's charge that Mikimoto's pearls were fake constituted a campaign of denigration seeking to induce the public into error. Scholars from Oxford and from Bordeaux University testified during the trial, arguing that there is no fundamental difference between natural and cultured pearls in terms of their formation and structure. In May 1924, a French civil court sided with Mikimoto. The court found that Japanese pearls can be regarded as high-quality gems, which have a nacreous nucleus covered in nacre. The ruling implied that Mikimoto's pearls could not be called fakes. A century later, we see a thriving market in cultured pearls, which are firmly established as real pearls, even though they are, in a sense, manufactured. Today, 99% of the pearls sold in the US are cultured pearls. Natural pearls are mostly museum pieces. Now, the FTC also regulates the marketing of pearls in the US, but the FTC regulations have a different tone when it comes to pearls versus diamonds. The FTC does distinguish between natural and cultured pearls. However, the agency's primary concern is with imitation pearls, those made from glass or plastic or shells that are treated to have a luster like real pearls. In the FTC's view, cultured pearls are fully authentic pearls. And unlike in the case of diamonds, the agency readily allows the use of the term cultured pearl standing alone. Cultured pearl manufacturers are not required to make a statement informing consumers that cultured pearls are articles of manufacture. Okay, so why the difference in treatment? Maybe it has to do with the difference between the traditional diamond industry, which is concentrated and extremely powerful, and the traditional pearl industry, which is neither. It may be that De Beers has the money and the cultural power to propagate a new authenticity narrative for so-called natural diamonds, whereas pearl producers lack the resources to convince us that the process of implanting foreign tissue into an oyster produces an inauthentic pearl. Perhaps it's just easier to argue that a laboratory process is inauthentic than it is to argue the same about a natural-sounding aquaculture process. Whatever the reason for the differences between the stories of diamonds and pearls, the deeper point here is that authenticity narratives are in both contexts shifting, contestable, and in the case of diamonds, rather obviously manufactured for a purpose. Now, you may be sensing, at least by now, the main takeaway of the book, which I'd summarize this way. Authenticity is not a quality, it's an ideology. I'll come back to that. But for now, I want to focus for a moment on another field beset with difficult questions of authenticity. So for years, the New Yorker magazine ran an unusual advertisement featuring the headline, "Unmask the Truth." It's not just about subprime mortgages and derivative insurance that bury honesty in legal mumbo jumbo, the ad said. A legal loophole allows some US wines to masquerade as something they're not. Champagne, the ad insisted, only comes from Champagne, France. Now, it may surprise you that most American sparkling wine producers don't appear to disagree with this assertion. American law does, in fact, allow US producers to label their products champagne, but none of the most respected American producers, Brooks, Domaine Carneros, Schramsberg, Gloria Ferrer, King Estate, Iron Horse, Argyle, none use the term. Only a few American wineries, mostly selling at lower price points, do. Mass market producer Corbel, for instance, sells a dozen different sparkling wines labeled California Champagne. These wines generally retail for between 10 and 20 bucks a bottle, which is obviously a significant discount over champagne from France. But the ads, which come from something called the French Champagne Bureau, are aimed at a larger point. Only sparkling wines from the Champagne region of France are authentic champagne. Any other sparkling wine using the term is a fake. Now, fake or not, what Corbel does, as we've already mentioned, is completely legal. But the relative freedom of US sparkling wine producers to call their product champagne is an anomaly. Many similar uses of common wide in food names outside their supposed places of origin are banned in an effort to identify and protect the allegedly authentic version. So here, you see 2 packets of cheese, one from Greece and marked feta, the other from Bulgaria and marked, pretty unhelpfully, Bulgarian sheep's cheese. Now, I say unhelpfully because the Bulgarian cheese, when it's until quite recently, marked feta. I took that picture in a grocery store. That was Bulgarian cheese I regularly buy, and I noticed the remarking, and I thought, okay, here's the law in action. That's a defensible label for it, feta, the Bulgarian cheese, because like the Greek cheese, it's made of sheep's milk. It's made by the same process employed to make feta in a region of Bulgaria that borders Greece, in which many of the people are ethnically Greek and speak the Greek language. So what's going on here? Well, it's the International Regime of Geographical Indications, or GIs, that forced the Bulgarian cheesemakers to relabel their cheese. Under the current GI rules, even calling the Bulgarian product feta-style cheese from Bulgaria would be prohibited. What are GIs? So they're roughly akin to trademarks, but with some important differences. They're source identifiers designating not a particular producer, but instead a given geographic location as the sole legitimate source of a good. So well-known examples include Bordeaux, Chablis, or Barolo for wine, or Parmesan, Roquefort, or Wensleydale for cheese. And the notion supporting these intellectual property rights, roughly, is that some combination of the physical characteristics, referred to as terroir, plus local knowledge, yields distinctive products. Use of the name on products from another location, this line of reasoning goes, is a form of fraud. Wines made outside of Bordeaux, the theory goes, can't be like Bordeaux. In other words, some products are not simply from a place, they're said to have special or even unique qualities that the place alone can provide. This is the crux of the argument in favor of using these sorts of rules to signal and protect authenticity. If California sparkling wines simply lack the essential qualities of champagne, then how can they be authentically labeled as champagne or even champagne-style sparkling wine? This is also why we see the Bulgarian cheese relabeled in a way that makes it difficult for consumers, frankly, to understand what in fact it is. Now, these arguments make some intuitive sense to quite a number of people. But to justify GIs, there actually has to be something to the concept of terroir. And for the justification to be strong, we'd have to be convinced that consumers' interests would not be served simply by making the label more clear. For example, requiring the wine to say California champagne, as Korbel does, and not just champagne, or simply relabeling the cheese from feta to Bulgarian feta cheese. There are reasons to doubt that terroir is as solid a concept as that. Here's one. Terroir is said to fundamentally depend on local physical conditions, like the quality of soil in a particular village, or the way the rain falls on a particular hillside. But this hyper-local account of geography and microclimate is belied by the sheer size of many GI areas. For some food and wine GIs, say feta cheese or tequila, the area covered by the naming rights can be extremely large. For feta, the entirety of Greece, which is 51,000 square miles. For tequila, the entirety of Mexico, which is 761,000 square miles. Even smaller GIs, like Bordeaux, aren't really that small. The GI covers the whole of the Department of the Gironde, which is 3,800 square miles. Even Bordeaux subregions, like the Medoc, 22 square miles, containing more than 1,500 vineyards, are big enough and contain varied enough terrain that one could wonder how consistent climatic and soil conditions are likely to be within the area. Now, this obviously raises a question of how terroir can explain what makes a Bordeaux or a feta authentic. And perhaps realizing this, the defenders of GIs sometimes acknowledge that the law is not just about climate and soil and the place-specific natural factors. In the long-running dispute over who can use the word feta, for example, the European Court of Justice, of all people, argued that there was a close interaction between natural factors and human innovation. In language that sounds, to me anyway, more like a marketing pitch than a judicial opinion, the court described the interaction in this way. The development of small native breeds of sheep and goats which are extremely tough and resilient, fitted for survival in an environment that offers little food in quantitative terms, but in terms of quality is endowed with extremely diversified flora, thus giving the finished product its own specific aroma and flavor. The interplay between the natural factors and the specific human factors, in particular their traditional production method, which requires straining without pressure, has given feta cheese its remarkable international reputation. Now, of course, despite the apparent ubiquity of these hardy native sheep and goats, Greek feta varies quite a bit in flavor and style. A New York Times article on the feta dispute noted that there are some obvious regional variations, and they quoted an expert on Greek cheese, an exporter of artisanal feta, admitting that feta from the Peloponnese tends to be harder, drier, and saltier than feta from Thessaly. Feta from Macedonia tends to be creamy and mild. Given this variation, as we've noted, in feta produced within the GI area itself, one might ask, if the sheep and goats, along with a veteran cheesemaker, were moved to, say, an especially dry part of Spain, they might produce something well within the range of variation for Greek feta, or at least close enough that a buyer might be happy to know that the cheese is very much like feta. And to just make sure any unwary buyer understood, perhaps the resulting cheese could be labeled Spanish feta to make the possibility of a difference very clear. But in Europe, none of that is allowed. And as European demands for expanded GI protection grow louder, those rules are slowly taking hold in the US as well. Now, Cal and I suspect that the broad scope of the prohibition is not really about protecting authenticity. It's more about the desire of the traditional producers to limit competition. To be clear, all GIs do is bar the use of certain descriptive words or place names. They don't bar the mimicking of style, of taste, or appearance. A wine called Chablis, but not made in Chablis, is illegal. But nothing stops a winemaker in Australia from making a wine that tastes like Chablis. GIs bar the use of the term Chablis or something that employs the name as a comparator, like Chablis style. The result, unfortunately, is consumer confusion, which is precisely what the law claims it's trying to avoid. But the confusion is a feature and not a bug of the law. It's created by, and in fact is intended by, this branch of the legal protection of authenticity. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the final subject of my talk, which is about this. On June 13th, 2020, the New York Times tweeted this pretty great photo of a heap of French fries covered in chunks of beef, sprigs of cilantro, and a cheesy sauce. The tweet read, "Carne asada fries are what happen when you take the toppings for a plate of beef nachos and put them over cheese fries instead of tortilla chips." Now, carne asada fries, something like a mashup of Canadian poutine and nachos, where on earth did that come from? The Times pointed to, of all places, Denver. Comments quickly poured in response, some of them pretty funny, like, this could be considered an attack on Mexican sovereignty. But some were just straight up pissed off. Moments like this, one commentator said, happen when your entire newsroom is only 5% Latino. So this attack on carne asada fries, that the dish is inauthentic and that a Latino newsroom would never have run it, aroused the ire of a writer for the Los Angeles Times, Gustavo Arellano. Arellano, the author of Taco USA, which is a terrific history of the taco in America, unfurled an epic Twitter rant celebrating carne asada fries. Arellano first gave a shout out to the author of the New York Times article, noting her knowledge of Mexican-American foodways and the correctness of her take that the recipe had taken hold in so-called Den-Mex cuisine. Arellano then lit out at the critics he tarred as, quote, wocosos, an insult Arellano defines as a bilingual portmanteau of woke and mocoso, which means snot-nosed brat in Spanish. So Den-Mex cuisine, he said, is so gloriously not authentic. Arellano tweeted that the wocosos could implode in their fury of cultural appropriation and their eschewing of tradition. It always amazes me, he continued, how self-appointed defenders of Mexican food know so little about Mexican food's manifestations in the United States. They erase, he said, decades of foodways by Mexican immigrants and Chicanos every time they dismiss dishes that don't fit their balsista rubric. Balsista, remember that term? I'll explain it in a minute. Experimentation, adaptation, and mestizaje, mixing, defines Mexican food, he said, and it's the reason why it's been so popular in the US for 140 years. Okay, so in one corner of the ring, are the people Arellano teased as belgistas. These are metaphorical followers of the Oklahoma-born chef Rick Bayless, whose Mexican restaurants and airport food halls purport to be true to Mexico's varied traditions. Bayless, a white man, had irritated Arellano when a decade ago he claimed, as he lent his name and recipes to a now shuttered Mexican restaurant in LA, he claimed to be curious about, quote, how the true flavors of Mexico from central and southern Mexico would play in Southern California. Now, you might see why this would annoy some people, Southern California being full of Mexicans and Mexican Americans who have their own understanding of the true flavors of Mexico. Now, in the other corner are people like Arellano who champion mixing and the sometimes terrible but sometimes phenomenal creations we get when differing traditions, techniques, and ingredients come together in the hands of free-thinking chefs. There's no question that creativity in cuisine is driven by tradition and innovation rubbing up against one another. When different culinary traditions are combined, an added dimension of creativity becomes possible. What happens, for example, if you take birria de res, a traditional dish from Jalisco of beef braised and stewed with chilies, and combine it with Japanese ramen? Well, you get LA birria in Los Angeles, and it's great. Authenticity in food can be the enemy of creativity because it valorizes the past rather than welcoming the creations of the future. In his sweeping account of Mexican food in the US, Arellano argues that the notion of what counts as authentic Mexican food, for many Americans at least, has largely been forged by a coterie of white chefs and food writers such as Rick Bayless, the guy from Oklahoma I mentioned earlier, and Diana Kennedy, an Englishwoman I'm about to discuss. Those people took Mexican cuisine seriously and introduced many wonderful new dishes to the US, but Arellano argues that they also, quote, introduced a fraudulent concept, unquote, to our understanding of Mexican food. The idea that the food they documented was authentic while the dishes offered at your neighborhood taco stand or sit-down casual restaurant were pretenders to be shunned. So where did the notion of authentic Mexican food that Arellano is complaining about come from? It originated in the cookbooks of the famed author and chef Diana Kennedy. Born in 1923 in rural southeast England, Kennedy married the New York Times Mexico correspondent and moved to Mexico in 1957. Despite being British and persisting throughout her life in Mexico in British customs such as daily tea, Kennedy became one of the best-selling Mexican cookbook authors and an influential voice in favor of a particular vision of authentic Mexican food. Kennedy's 9 books, including the compendium The Cuisines of Mexico, elevated Mexican food in the esteem of chefs and home cooks around the world, and she was awarded the Order of the Aztec Eagle, which is the highest honor Mexican government can bestow on a civilian. In the US, Kennedy's books became the window through which American chefs discovered the regional styles of Mexico. That window, however, afforded a particular and particularly slanted perspective. Kennedy's notion of authenticity, as food scholar Ignacio Sanchez Prado argues, was always rooted in rejecting modernization, which seeks to preserve at all costs both labor and production structures of rural areas as embodiments of the authentic. The authentic, for Kennedy, and indeed for Rick Bayless as well, can be found deep in Mexico, in places like Oaxaca, or at least somewhere far from big cities, or beach resorts, or border towns. The inauthentic is in the cities, or at the border, where influences can mix. Or even worse, they're deep in the US, corrupted with local ingredients like French fries. Kennedy's is now the dominant framing of what constitutes authentic Mexican food. It is the framing that critics like Gustavo Arellano are attempting to resist. And for good reason, because as a model for authenticity, the Kennedy account, for all its good intentions, is essentially a settler construct. Kennedy, an English ruralite, locates the origins of Mexico's authentic cuisine in the country's hinterlands. And yet Mexico is, and long has been, a highly urbanized country. Mexico City, for example, with a population exceeding 9 million, is bigger than any American city, and more than 80% of Mexico's population lives in a city. So Kennedy was an outsider, a romantic, attached to a rural Mexico she imagines to be the real country. Urban Mexicans, Mexicans living on the border or in the US, these are the millions excluded by her as originators of Mexican foodways. How odd that this Englishwoman essentially manufactured a model of authenticity for Mexican cuisine one which anchors that cuisine to the past and largely writes off the contributions and innovations of urban Mexicans and Mexicans living in the United States. And it's weirder still that the Mexican government, knowingly, and American foodies, largely unknowingly, adopted this framework. It's now the foundation for our discussions of what authentic Mexican food is, what is fake, and what counts as cultural appropriation. So I want to close by pulling on a thread that connects our discussion of diamonds and pearls and wine and cheese to the story of Diana Kennedy and the understanding she gave us, for better or worse, of authentic Mexican food. It's something I mentioned before, and I'll repeat it. Authenticity is not a quality, it's an ideology. Put somewhat differently, authenticity doesn't exist aside from the conceptual and sometimes legal frameworks that we build to establish and enforce it. It's also worth noting that our concepts of authenticity often skew small c conservative. Our instinct to valorize the authentic is often part of our broader desire to recover or imagine a more stable, comfortable past. Traditional societies didn't care about what was authentic because change in almost everything was very slow. And so nearly everything they did or ate was part of their heritage. For most of human history, people lived in largely closed groups and small settlements. There was very little mixing, only tradition. But once trade and migration took off, cities grew, and peoples began to live amongst one another, blending of traditions inevitably occurred, and the pace of cultural change began to accelerate. And in this, some saw and some see a threat. In today's hyperdiverse world, our obsession with the authentic seems perhaps simply natural. But it's a throwback or a vestige of the fear that arrived with modernity, fear of cultural unmooring and drift, of deracination and meaninglessness, of the instability of signs and symbols and all formally fixed reference points. There's much more to unpack, but for now, I'll suggest that much of the debate over the authentic reflects a yearning to slow down change and keep categories and meaning stable. We see this in the food world. This is an authentic Mexican dish. That is not. It also reflects heightened economic and social competition. That dynamic is crystal clear with regard to protected place names, such as Champagne, where the goal is very much to keep New World wines, or even other French wines, at bay. It's also true of diamonds, where a crumbling cartel seeks to shore itself up against a technological threat. These factors are at play in many other areas that Cal and I explore in the book. Finally, a word about the politics of authenticity. Much of the current debate over authenticity, especially when it connects to fights over cultural appropriation, comes from the left. The left, with its fixation on identity and relations of power, tends to think authentic items can only come from specific communities, especially if the community in question is a marginalized one. The identical dish or artwork prepared by the wrong person is inauthentic. But the political right also favors a focus on the authentic, and indeed, in its fixation on the traditional, its fear of the other and the outsider, and its reverence for the past, the right, perhaps, is the natural political home of authenticity policing. What are political implications about real Americans versus coastal elites, other than claims about authenticity? I can't end without acknowledging that we live in extraordinarily turbulent times. And I fear that debates about authenticity lie below many of our festering political antagonisms. The line between authentic and inauthentic, and between inauthenticity and impurity, is a close and dangerous one to draw. My point for now is simply that authenticity is not just another culture war topic, although it can seem like that at times. Both sides of the political debate are invested in ideologies of authenticity, and that alone should give us pause. With that, thank you, and I look forward to your questions. So who will take the cue? Is it Dave?
Thank you so much.
Sure.
This is really interesting. And I'm thinking about it in terms of conversations we've been having in Professor Boyle's class about generative AI and what happens when you can no longer tell a human from another thing. And I feel like authenticity comes into here, and it's a place where we might want to say that we should uphold authenticity. but I kind of feel like your message is that maybe we shouldn't and we should question it and push away that. So what's your take there? What thoughts do you have?
So I've been thinking a lot about what makes humans authentically human. And it used to be a pretty easy thing to say that we were authentically human in part because we're creative, right? That unlike any other living organism, we are creative. So I've seen some elephants paint, and I'm not 100% sure that elephants aren't also creative, but like set that aside, because that's a relatively minor phenomenon. I don't think the elephants are threatening the markets for human created art. Now, AI, of course, is, right? And so what is AI doing? It's not engaging in creativity in the way we understand it as a human activity. It's not ingesting like we do when we're kids. We go to the art museum and we see all these paintings, right? Let's say impressionist paintings. And we somehow kind of intuit an understanding of what an impressionist painting is, because we've seen lots of examples and we understand at some level what characterizes them. And then if we're artistically talented, one day we can recreate that. We can make a new impressionist painting, one that takes the conventions of the genre and makes a new image from them. So if you think of what AI is doing, obviously it's not the same, but at some level of abstraction, it's similar. Okay, so what AI is doing is it's ingesting. So that word contains a lot of imprecision, but it is using data. So let's say a training corpus built up of impressionist paintings. It's using that data to build a statistical model that basically models the features that make an impressionist painting an impressionist painting. So if it does that correctly, if the AI builds a statistical model based on what it sees, right, what it has ingested, you can say to it, make me an image of a boat on the Seine, and it will make you an image in the impressionist style of a boat on the Seine. And that image, if the AI is doing its job correctly, is plausible as an artifact of human creativity. That is to say, it might be difficult for a human judge to tell the difference between a human-produced impressionist image and this AI-produced, this machine-produced impressionist image. So there's two ways to react to that. One way is just do what the French pearl merchants did and to say, well, this is not a real pearl, so this is not real creativity. And the question I'm interested in really is like, why not? Right? So it is plausible as an artifact of human creativity. So what is it about our creativity that we think we should privilege? So part of it is just like, we want people to be able to engage in creative labor and get paid for it. Right? So maybe there's an economic argument for why we should privilege that. I don't personally find that very compelling. So why? A few generations ago, there were almost a couple 100,000 people, mostly women in the United States, who were telephone operators. What were they doing? They were sitting at switchboards connecting people over a network. Then the transistor, right, the computerized switch was invented, and all those people were gone in the blink of an eye. We have typically not, as a culture, committed to preserving jobs when technological progress comes along and eliminates those jobs. And so if there are fewer writers of sonnets and there are fewer makers of paintings in the future, we need to explain why we're sheltering those people when we didn't shelter the poor telephone operators or the many, many categories of jobs that just came and went as the march of technology proceeded. Now again, do I think that these are troubling questions? Yes, I do. But maybe we should start thinking again about what makes a human authentic. So AI can be creative, maybe, at least at a metaphorical level. AI can't be brave. AI can report facts, but it can't tell the truth, right? It doesn't know truth from falsity. So maybe we should relocate something about us, what makes us authentic, away from talents that we have and toward moral capacities that we have. Like dogs, what makes a dog authentic? I love dogs, okay? And it's not really for their intelligence, it's for their loyalty, right? And they have a great quality to them. So maybe we just need to search for that quality in us. And maybe what AI is telling us is that creativity is not it. David.
Well, I must say, this is a brilliant lecture, although, to be fair, you really can't go wrong if you lecture on semiotics. It's just a wonderful subject. I want to ask you about ideology. I might think that another word that would fit better is something like belief or faith, which seem to me to be broader than ideology and less confining is probably better given your subject. I want to ask you to consider, and then I will subside. 40 years ago, I was asked to join a group of lawyers representing a Hollywood studio who were engaged in colorizing a well-known movie called It's a Wonderful Life. It's a Wonderful Life starred James Stewart and Donna Reed, and it was directed by Frank Capra. It's a wonderful movie. When we finished doing this, and the question behind all of this in law was whether or not the colorized version could claim some part of copyright, which would require some expressive work and some originality. When we finished, I had a copy of the colorized version, of course, and one of our sons watched it and he said, you know, that's a really great movie. He said, I can tell you, I wouldn't watch anything in black and white, but the color is really great. Well, James Stewart appeared in public and denounced the work that we had done at some length, and he had some real reason to feel upset about it. It was, by his own account, his own favorite movie. No part he'd ever played was more important. And he said in the course of his remarks, if Frank Capra knew about what you've done, he would be turning over in his grave. Well, it happened that Frank Capra actually hadn't died. And Frank Capra was the one who had advised us about every shade of color that appeared in the original framing of the movie, and there were many one-sheets and photos that supported it. Frank Capra appeared and said, I love this movie. Now I ask you, was the colorized version of It's a Wonderful Life an authentic piece of work, or was it not? And how would we approach that?
Yeah, so let me take your questions in order. So the first point that you make, let me take your questions in order. So the first point that you make about belief rather than ideology. So I think here there's a delicate question about what we want to emphasize. And I think belief is in fact the broader category, and it is descriptive of how many of us receive arguments about authenticity. We believe them, right? They're not facts so much. They're not qualities of the artifacts that we're talking about, like diamonds or pearls or wine or any of these things. They're beliefs about those things. I think the reason we chose ideology, and this is draft so we can rethink it, the reason we chose ideology has to do with the forces in that are essentially authoring these narratives, right? So these narratives are constructed, right, often quite purposely. And we chose that word mostly to emphasize that, although I think you're correct that there's another way to look at it, a broader way, which may be more useful. Your second point about authenticity in It's a Wonderful Life, the black and white version or the colorized version. So here I think this is really interesting because questions of taste, we tend to have a habit of resolving questions of taste into questions of authenticity, which I think is a really bad reflex that we have. So let me give you an example. So recently I watched the Keira Knightley version of Pride and Prejudice. So Elizabeth Bennet is simply my favorite character in all of literature. I identify with her, I love her. She's so clever and she's so funny and she's so loyal and she understands a lot about people, but she also makes mistakes. And when she makes mistakes, she tries to make them right. I mean, everything that I admire about people, I see in her. It's always seemed funny to me that there's a vogue, there has been for a while, of noting that like only women can write about women. Or only people from within a certain group can write about people from within that group, because always, from the time I first read Pride and Prejudice, I was maybe 12 or 13 years old, I thought, this character is important, and that has never changed for me all through my life. I was watching the Keira Knightley remake for like the dozenth time, and one thing I noticed, which is like, you notice something every time, it was very purposeful. When they are talking about the Lady Catherine de Bourgh, the terrible, overweening aunt who basically tries to prevent the marriage between Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet. When they show Rosling Park, her castle, it is Baroque. It's got tons of towers and gargoyles and stuff sticking off of it. And when they show Pemberley, the Manse of Darcy, it is the Parthenon. It is essentially Greek revival. It is clean and linear and restrained. And to me, those are aesthetic differences. So some people like Baroque, some people like classical Greek style architecture, but for the filmmakers in that movie, it wasn't just a taste difference, it was an authenticity difference. So the Darcys are authentically noble. They are noble like the Greeks were noble. And the de Bourghs, notice the name of kind of like more recent French vintage, they are inauthentically noble. They are crass, right? They just happen to have money. So with the movie, I think, well, there are some people who think the authentic movie is the black and white movie in all its richness, right? And some people, like your son, looks at color and sees life, right? And wants to see life in the movie, that element of life, and enjoys that aesthetically. And that aesthetic enjoyment, to me, is like his business, right? This is not an authenticity argument. It's an enjoyment argument.
It becomes an authenticity argument if you realize that Frank Capra loved the colorized version, it seems to me.
I mean, if he could have made one back then, maybe he would have, right? Yes, Michael.
Picking up on this thread, so yeah, there's a difference between authenticity and taste and preferences, but like the bigger part of your project about how these other forces, whether it's the regulators or the industry itself, kind of shaping the perceptions of what's authentic, they're very much doing that all over the place on just broader preferences as well. So then the question is ultimately then I guess, what's unique about authenticity as in terms of like that broader relationship about kind of like what's leading there?
Sure. So I think what's unique about authenticity is when we violate authenticity norms, they're not just preferences, they have this binding nature to them. If we violate norms or if we violate law, we can pay the price. So if we violate the law of geographic indications, we can be fined. If we violate authenticity norms with respect to trade or law with respect to trademark goods, we can actually be jailed. If we violate authenticity norms with respect to cultural appropriation, we can be called out on Twitter or whatever it's called now. There's consequences to this, right? Versus preference formation, which I always think of as the broader topic. You're right, in itself very interesting, where people are convinced of things. They're convinced that they have a desire, right? And from the economist's perspective, like once that convincing has happened, they have a preference. The markets kind of sort on the basis of that preference. But I think one thing that's usually the case, not always, but usually the case is if you don't have that preference, what are the consequences? You might have a little bit more trouble satisfying the preferences you do have. So for example, I live in America. I have a preference for small, expensive hatchbacks like they have in Europe. I can't really fulfill that preference here. It's very difficult, but woe unto me, no big deal, I'll live. It's a little bit different than preferences that turn into authenticity rules or authenticity norms that have this kind of binding effect. But you're right that the two things do shade into one another. Yes, Artie.
So now you're beginning to make me think of a literature that you probably do engage in your book, but it is the literature about disgust. And I assume you've engaged with Martha Nussbaum and those folks who think about disgust and what that means, because it seems to me you're veering very close to that. So
some authenticity norms are based in triggering a feeling of disgust. So for example, authenticity norms that have to do with food rules have a basis to that. Some don't. So I think the argument about diamonds maybe kind of trades a little bit in that, but it's mostly an argument about the nature of the thing. So in other words, what makes a diamond special is its production in the earth. Now again, not too long ago, no one cared, right? That was kind of taken for granted because there was no other locus of production. So sometimes it intersects with disgust, sometimes it doesn't. Authenticity comes from a whole bunch of different sources.
going back to Michael's
Yeah.
if it's just preferences, then that's something else.
Right.
But I don't know, when you responded to Michael, you really seemed to invoke a kind of a visceral, moral kind of judgment that authenticity relates to. And that seems to me closer to the literature and discuss. So we can talk
think about that. But so the moral judgment, so for example, Okay, so if I'm drinking a sparkling wine that isn't champagne, if I'm drinking a Loire Valley sparkler, that may be perfectly good to the occasion. I may enjoy that. I may actually prefer that wine. This is just a preference, right? When it becomes something more than a preference is when I market a Loire Valley sparkler and saying it's champagne style wine, okay? Then it becomes more than a preference. And then punishments follow, right? So as I understood the discussed literature, just because punishments follow doesn't mean that the prohibition is rooted in intuitions about disgust or feelings of disgust. But this is the difference that I tried to outline with Michael.
End of our time.
Okay.
Maybe you can
Thank you.
stay afterwards for a couple of
Sure.
minutes for other
Happy to
more
do that.
casual
Thank you very
questions.
much.